Hey there, welcome to the channel. So today we're going to look at GDP. It went negative. Kind of a surprise. Okay, so here we are. We're going to look at what happened with the GDP. It looks like we had a negative print. So I'm going to look at the release here from the BEA, and they provide more details. And let's kind of take a look into it and try to figure out, if we can learn anything about maybe where this is coming from, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a minus 1.4% GDP for the first quarter of 2022. So just going back at the chart here, the top level chart that we see here, what we can see is that we had, the shutdown for Cerveza. We had this massive dip in 2020 Q2, almost minus 35. And then they just this huge increase, almost plus 35 in the next quarter. So what had really happened here is that, they had shut down and everything. And then they basically started doing all kinds of stimulus and all that stuff. So they really just cranked this thing back up. And since that time, we've had variations of basically positive GDP, but you would call it milder, So we have some prints of 5% annualized and stuff. But surprisingly, we get this hit over here, minus 1.4%. So let's kind of take a look and try to figure out where that's coming from. So we're going to go down to this table here. If my autistic son would stop making so much noise over there, that would help. And then my wife yelling at him because he's making so much noise. Wonderful. Okay. So what I want to do here, yes, I'm going to go with this level of zoom. So let's kind of figure out what's going on. First of all, let's look at the broad categories. Personal consumption expenditures. So first of all, we have the print here, minus 1.4%. And then we're going to look at all the main categories and try to figure out what's going on with the subcategories. So first of all, personal consumption, this was up at 2.7%. So that contributed positively as far as I can tell. However, there's one noticeable thing here. We had a good number on durable goods is 4.1%, but non-durable goods were minus 2.5%. Now, non-durables were non-durables are things like food and stuff like that. So it could be stuff that's perishable, but it also includes things like clothes and stuff like that as well. So that was kind of interesting. Now, gross private domestic investment, this is your kind of investment by businesses and stuff like that. So that was positive at 2.3. And then we have our net exports of goods, services. So they give you the exports and imports. And for right now, what we'll notice is on the imports. So now the imports as a positive number, this will get subtracted. Exports as a negative number, this will contribute negatively. So basically take a minus a positive, you're going to get a larger negative number. So that's going to contribute to things, and we'll see how that figures into this later as well. The next area to look at as a broad category is the government consumption and expenditures. Now, this was a minus 2.7%. Very interesting there. If we look at this guy, we can see at the federal level minus 5.9%, and a big chunk of it was defense. So defense dropped off minus 8.5%, and non-defense minus 2.2%. So this is definitely an area that was contributing negatively to GDP. In this, I'll show you, is going to be contributing negatively to GDP as well. And the positive was on this investment side here. So let's go to the next table and see if we can find some more details. It's kind of interesting here in the exports. They don't kind of give you the overall number here. So we'll have to go look at that further down in the report. All right, so now let's go and down to the next table. The next table here is the contributions to percent change in real GDP. So once again, this is good. What we're doing is we're starting out over here. We have this negative number, minus 1.4, and we're going to look at all the different categories. And I'm going to keep it, focused on the higher level. So your PCE, personal consumption, that was a positive 1.8% overall. The goods was down a little bit, and services, a part of it was mostly due to services, because services part was 1.86. This was 1.03. Put that together, you get 1.83 positive. So the consumption looked, as far as all this goes, consumption looked good. Okay, now let's go down to the private investment. Well, once again, on the private investment, we saw before that overall this gross private investment contributed positively, but it's only 0.43% of the overall. So 1.27 was fixed investment, and then there's change in inventories had a negative value. So that kind of gave us a net of a small positive 0.43 value. So contributing positively there. So we really got to find out where the negatives are coming in. Where are those really big negative numbers that we have? So let's see if we see that here. Now, let's look at the next category here that we want to see. So let's look at the net exports. So here's how it works is this is the big guy in the room. This is really the big guy, minus 3.2. Okay, so minus 3.2%. Now, why? Because we had our exports, and our exports are very often not very high and very often negative if you just kind of scan back. But you had some points where it was positive over here and a positive over here, but it was a negative and maybe a relatively small negative number. But our imports here, our imports were contributing a huge negative number. Now, so going back to the other table, what does that mean? We saw that our imports were huge, very large imports. Hence, the imports are subtracted out of GDP. So basically, you get a minus 2.5 contribution from the imports because it's treated as negatively or not contributing or taking away from the GDP. Okay. And so that's why we get this big minus 3.2. So this explosion in imports is a major factor that has affected this particular number. However, notice this other periods, there were other periods with high imports as well, negative contributions that we didn't really necessarily have a negative GDP. So now looking at another negative portion, government consumption and expenditures. So here we go. This is also another negative portion. And you can see at the federal level, most of it is from the federal level here at minus 0.39. And where this is coming from, this is really coming from national defense dropping, consumption expenditures dropping, and then some of it is gross investment dropping. But in the big thing about it, and consumption expenditures dropping a little bit there. But in the big picture, what you have is you have a reduction in government spending. So that contributed negatively to GDP and this huge, large imports without backing up with exports. So now, want to look into that. So let's go back up to the first table. And the part I want to look at here on this first table is I really want to, the import-export is a more challenging thing because, we're not a big exporting country. And so it's sort of like, if we look at these numbers and we say to ourselves, we're just going to imports of goods. Let's look at goods. So we're going to look at this column. So 20, you got an import of 2019. So these are big numbers, and our exports were, very low during this time. Now here, the exports actually were fairly good and they counterbalanced somehow in the previous quarter. So that would be the December quarter of last year. So not sure how that worked out, but trying to kind of figure this out is, we do import a lot. So you can see that there's very often significant imports. And then what we do see is this massive drop off. Now, this, of course, this area, the massive drop off was in the shutdown for the Cerveza and all that stuff. So this is kind of interesting. So in reality, our GDP is very much held hostage, it appears to me, by the situation with import exports. If we don't have any exports going out or very little, we are very susceptible to a negative GDP print. And if we do have high imports, it's more than just supply chain issues at these ports. I mean, some of these imports are near record import levels, and this, could be a part of a strain on things, on our ports and the ability to just handle the amount of imports coming in. Now, but let's take a look at this category here, government expenditures here. This is another thing that affects us. So if we look at it, we see, wow, we got a minus 2.7, significant number. And we saw that actually net import-export contributed more to the negative than this, but this did contribute to that negative print on GDP. So what I want to look at here is let's look at really non-defense. Yeah, I want to look at this non-defense federal spending. So this is where all those stimmies, all the stimmy checks, the federal extra unemployment benefits, all that stuff is coming into play here. And notice how when they shut down the economy, we have these huge inputs here, stimmies, all kinds of government spending. And then over here, another big surge of government spending. And what you see is that this really helps your GDP. This is a significant contribution to a positive GDP in those quarters. And what you see, though, is after they do the stimulus, then it rapidly falls off. The contribution basically becomes a negative contribution. Now, it wasn't as super negative. It was only minus 2.2 here. However, it's worth noting that if you're looking at this number and you have a negative GDP and you really don't want, let's say Biden administration really don't want to declare another recession here, then, what is he going to do? What could you do? Well, so now we're going to transition to the speculation. We come back and summarize really quick. We have two major factors that really affected and caused the negative GDP this quarter. First of all, our import-export, lots of imports, a drop in exports. That contributed, and also a drop-off in government spending. So now, what can you do about that? Now, if you look at what the Biden administration do, or what could they do? Well, they can't affect this. They really can have very little, if any, effect on the import-export situation. That's just going to be a situation where what are you going to do about it? You can't do anything about it. So, if stuff is made here or not made here, you can't do anything quickly about it. However, look at this one over here. Look how much of an effect they have. So this is what I wonder, in pure speculation, are they going to try to do something about this? In other words, let's have more stimmies. That would be the easiest way to break that second quarter of negative GDP. If they could get stimmies out within that period of time, get a bunch of government spending going, they could easily flip that. The other side of the coin that will be interesting is, we know right now we have all these shutdown in the ports. All these shutdowns are going to be interesting, because what that should mean is that the next quarter, so Q2, we should have probably either a much smaller imports or a negative imports. Now that would be a positive for the U.S. in terms of GDP. We have less imports coming in because they're closing down their ports on the China side. Well, if that's the case, now as long as our exports don't go to the floor, as long as our exports are not affected as much, then that could basically break the cycle. And so this is all speculation, but that would be kind of the situation that we might be looking at. So this may in fact be a one-off. It may be a one-off. It could also be the sign that, well, we do have a lot of high inflation, et cetera. And in here, there's something called the deflator, and the deflator was at 8%, and the deflator is another measure of inflation. So at this point, it's not apparent that there's an inflection in inflation. This of course, is looking back over the previous quarter, but still, you haven't seen the inflation has dropped off. So we have that situation going on where you have high inflation, people are struggling to afford things, et cetera. This is going to dampen economic activity. As we saw in the numbers here, you could actually speculate that in our non-durable goods, this kind of area this area right here, where we saw this minus 2.5% here, non-durable goods in this area here, is this possibly indicating a drop off? Is this minus 2.5 indicating people struggling to buy food, et cetera, clothes, stuff like that? Is that kind of an indication that the recession is starting and that inflation has finally got to people? It could be. So I think that's it for this one. The two areas, once again, the import-export and the government spending, that caused negative GDP. See how it goes. All right, talk to you later. Bye.